All right, well, hello, everybody. Good afternoon. So I'm super excited that we have Dr. Cullen Merritt here with us today, both personally as a good friend and also as just an amazing scholar and colleague. So if you don't know Dr. Cullen Merritt, he is an associate professor at IUPUI at SPIA, and he is also the director of the undergraduate honors program there, also an associate of PAR, and also is going to be a university president someday. I told him this when I met him as a PhD student. So we met at a PMRC conference and we were sitting and having lunch, and I'm like, you are going to be a university president someday. I'm like, I just know this about you because he just has this amazing he really does. Like beyond deep. Like he's like, no offense to my he's your boss someday. That's right. But he's just really inspiring. And so he has does excellent research, also has done some work on publicness, by the way, which is super cool and awesome. But it also just thinks about things in an awesome way. So I think it does qualitative and quantitative methods, which I know a lot of you guys are both interested in both of those things, and a great mentor too. So, all right, turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Stephanie. And folks, it's good to see y'all. I'm grateful for the invitation. And I should state that this is the first time I'm presenting this. And so I welcome your feedback. I'm used to positive comments. I'm used to negative comments, but know that I care deeply about your perspectives because that's the way academia works in terms of peer review and perspectives from others. So in terms of the topic, service shaming in academia, sources, consequences, and management. So in terms of the objective, I believe that faculty are oftentimes pushed away from service. Now, this isn't done in a malicious way always. When it comes to research universities, oftentimes the focus is on research, and quite frankly, it should be. But sometimes oftentimes, quite frankly, the issue with our culture is that we disregard other important aspects of academic life. And I'm wanting to focus on faculty service. Service shaming, in terms of a specific definition, this is my working definition currently, it's a social phenomenon in academia in which institutions and norms limit or discourage authentic faculty participation or leadership in activities categorized as service. So this is an exploratory study. I care about the sources of service shaming. Where does it originate? How does it manifest? Where does it come from? Where does it start? And I'm wanting that through the perspective of faculty members. I want to talk about the consequences as well, right? What are the issues here? Why is this problematic? Why should we be concerned? What are the implications? We talk about public administration in terms of how it impacts people. Well, guess who's a part of that? Faculty members, people who work at universities, right? So oftentimes we focus on the implications for society writ large when it comes to public administration research. I think that's great, but through this study, we're going to learn what are those effects on faculty members, and then management. I don't believe in naming an issue, studying an issue, if we're not going to try to come up with solutions to address it. So we're going to talk about how do we manage or eradicate service shaming. I think eradication is the goal. I'm not sure it's possible, but that's not going to stop me from wanting to do that or speak about how that can be the case. But I just don't want to talk about management from an organizational perspective. I also want to talk about management from an individual level perspective. Faculty members who have experienced service shaming, I want them to cope. I want them to navigate their experiences in this space. So what's the motivation behind this? You know, I think, in my opinion, the best scholars do not study things simply to get publications. And you can disagree, that's totally fine. I figured I'm the one presenting, so I'm going to let y'all know where I stand on issues. I think the best scholars are those who are in some way, whether it be in small part or in large part, connected to the issue that they're studying. that they care about it, or maybe they know somebody else who's affected by the issue that they're studying. Or maybe you haven't experienced something, but the issue that you are studying affects a certain community or communities that you care deeply about. Because when you're going through the peer review process, right, rejected articles, people critiquing your work, there has to be something that helps you say, man, this is why I'm in this. So I want to tell you about my scholarly motivation behind studying service shaming. First, I would like to study the biased, toxic, and counterproductive norms in academia. And I don't want this to be a talk that kind of centers on, well, every organization is dysfunctional. Yeah, that's true. But I think oftentimes we study these issues everywhere else. How about we study these issues in the places we operate? And I want to be a part of the change, both as a scholar, but as a person who tries to bring about change in academia when it comes to service shaming. And I don't think this research is just about higher education. That is, of course, the context of this study. But I think at a very basic level, it's about the role of public institutions in meeting their commitments in serving society. Service does that. Service helps the institution, right? Faculty service helps us function. Think about things in the university space. Think about the things you complain about. Think about your concerns within the university space. If you take away service, your concerns are going to be a lot worse. And because we have students who are stakeholders, because we have faculty and staff who are also stakeholders, what we do at university to impact the public through our internal service matters. But service also expands to the broader community. There's service that occurs where we are engaging with people who may not have a connection with the university. Why do we do it? We do it because we care deeply about how our work enhances the livelihood of those stakeholders that, whether directly or indirectly, can benefit by the work of the university. And then when you think about public administration, why should we ground this work in public administration? Why shouldn't just some scholar in higher education study this? Well, I think they can and should study these issues. But here's why I want to study. Here's why I coined the term service shaming. Here is why I'm trying to introduce this concept into our conversation. It's because I believe my training as a public administration scholar really positions me and other scholars very nicely to address these issues. When you think about the creation of public value, when you think about professional norms, when you think about creating strong organizational cultures, when you think about performance assessment, all of those issues will help us think about service shaming and address the causes and the issues that are tied to service shaming. You know, I think sometimes when it comes to public administration, man, it's really easy to overlook how vast our field is in terms of positioning us to think about so many social issues that perhaps no other field is better able or better equipped to address. And I care about this too, because are we practicing what we preach? You know, I'm sure most folks in this classroom, whether you're teaching an undergraduate course, whether you're teaching a graduate course, PhD course, you're interacting with students in some way. You know, I refuse to enter a classroom and talk about the value of service, the value of uplifting your communities, the value of being transformational, bringing about change. And then when it comes to looking at higher education in the field that I operate in as a scholar, right? And by field, I mean higher education writ large. Why should I ignore it? Right? And that goes back to a point I stated earlier. We have to really undermine these counterproductive norms in higher education, mainly because the students that we teach, those that we engage with, are going to go out into the world. And if we don't call out these issues, then when are things going to change? So the purpose of this slide is certainly to show you my motivation. So for me, this is deeply personal because I care deeply about the people who are affected by service shaming. And I care deeply about the communities, whether it be inside the university or outside the university, who can be harmed when we just let service shaming take shape without thinking about it and without doing anything about it. So faculty service, in terms of background, as you all know, it's when faculty members apply their expertise in some way to make a difference in the communities that they serve outside of the university. So think about community engaged service, where you are applying your expertise, say, in the study of nonprofit organizations to help a nonprofit organization function. And that external service is so critical. But guess what's also critical? Service to the university. Oftentimes we talk about committees as if they are these mundane structures where we have to attend meetings and nothing ever gets done. And while that certainly may be the case for some committees, I want us all to pause and think about why those committees are in place. It's because there are issues within the university that need to be addressed, or there are issues that have not been discussed. And if we leave those issues unchanged, then they're going to affect the university in a very negative way. So in terms of faculty service, I want us to think about this in a very broad way. Again, inside the university, it matters. You take away service, get rid of service, and I guarantee you we cannot function. If you take away service, I'm not sure I'm even here today having a conversation with you about service shaming, right? But again, service is also outside of the institution as well. So I want you to see where I'm coming from in that perspective, have a very expansive view of service. And when you go back to the very founding of public universities, it wasn't simply about researching, which is important. It's not simply about faculty engaging in instructional and teaching practices, although that's important too. It's also about service and applying our knowledge to better our communities within and certainly outside of the university as well. And the key point about service that we have to keep in mind is that it must have benefits to stakeholders that extend beyond yourself. I'm not really impressed when people oftentimes, or sometimes rather, categorize service as something where they are making a difference in the community when in fact they're the only person who's benefiting from participating in it. Service is important because it extends beyond the benefit that you may receive from participating in these activities. But here's the issue. We know the three core responsibilities of faculty members. There's research, there's teaching, and there's service. And if you go to most, at least research universities, service is always third. We know it. We're socialized to think that way as PhD students. We're socialized to think that way as assistant professors, associate professors, full professors, right? That service is just third place. If you know of an institution that has it first, then I would love to speak to that institution and learn more about what they're doing. Now, let me be clear what this presentation is not about. This is not about service or research rather being unimportant or teaching being unimportant. I want to be very clear because I don't want anyone going to APAM or PMRC or speaking with their colleagues and saying, yeah, Dr. Merritt gave a really interesting presentation. He actually doesn't value research and teaching. That is not what this presentation is about, right? It's about understanding the current state of service. It's about understanding service shaming and what we can do to uplift this responsibility. And then when you look at the reward structures and the incentive structures tied to service, there's not really any incentive, right? Unless it's kind of intrinsic inside of you. If you look at governing documents, at universities or specific academic units within universities, the incentive structures are not there, right? So think about this. We are really told both formally and informally that service, quite frankly, doesn't matter, at least to the level that research and teaching matter. So my theoretical framework in thinking about this issue, and then this is exploratory, but I think it's pretty straightforward. There's service shaming. Service shaming is grounded in academic institutions and norms. So there are, I'm theorizing, formal institutions that give rise to service shaming. And there are informal norms and institutions that also give rise to service shaming. I think this leads to inauthenticity. I think when faculty are service shamed, and let's say those individuals care deeply about service, they care deeply about what they can do to better their communities, they care deeply about being transformational in terms of how they impact those they serve outside of research and teaching, man, I think it drains them. I think they feel they're coming to work, or at least I'm theorizing that they're coming to work, and that they're less excited because who they are in a very authentic way is not valued by the university when it comes to service. I mean, make it personal. Think about something that you care about that is not necessarily tied to research and teaching. Think about it. Think about a committee that you served on or a cause that you're trying to address that means a lot to you. Now, think about afterwards, you basically being told you engaging in that doesn't matter. And moreover, you're expected to carry forward and engage in your job, knowing good and well that the service activity or activities that you care about aren't really viewed by the university or the people within it with any degree of respect. It's hard to come to work each day authentic and motivated to be a force for change in the space of service. And I think that leads to organizational withdrawal. I think that leads to decreased organizational commitment. And that looks different for different people, right? Some people can show up to work each day and man, they can look like they're really performing well and they care about the university and they care about the people around them, but boy, is it eating them up inside. There are people who stop showing up to work. There are people, in theory, who, quite frankly, just leave who they are at home and they show up each day and they're just going through the motions. It can happen. This is my theory. So how are we going to go about seeing if anything I'm saying is actually true? No. I think Alan posed a really good question to me when I was setting up, when he was setting up, rather, I didn't. When you were setting me up to present, and Alan, I believe you asked, something to the effect of, how did you become interested in this? And then the second question was, how did you know that this was worthy of investigation, right? And man, that's a huge risk because I know what it's like to want to study something and to want to create a theory and research around it. And the data is just telling a different story. So I had to lead into it, Alan, right? I had to speak with people. I had to talk with people and hold my breath during interviews that what I'm seeing is actually true. Now, the sad part about this is I wish I didn't have to study it, right? I wish that I could interview folks and I don't want to get too ahead of the game here, but I wish that everything that I talked about actually did not exist. But I think part of research is trying to figure out whether or not the things you care about are things that you're only concerned about, or if these are things that are of organizational consequence writ large, right? And so one of the things I want to impress upon each of you is that, yeah, I showed the scholarly motivation that I have. I'm deeply motivated to address this issue. But if it's an issue that's only something I'm experiencing anecdotally, then one could argue that that may not be a research agenda that's worthy of pursuing. So let me build upon my motivation. The reason I care about this is because I think it's widespread, right? So let's see if I'm right, or the extent to which I'm right. So so this was a qualitative study. It's exploratory, right? So in order to get at the sources, the consequences, and the management practices that are tied to service shaming, I need to talk to folks. So I engaged in a purposive selection of full-time tenured and non-tenured track faculty at a public research university in the Midwest. Also decided to reach out to retirees, right? One of the nice things about universities is that they oftentimes keep those who have retired, their contact information listed. And as having family members who retired, man, they are honest. And so I wanted to talk to people who had nothing to lose, right, when it came to understanding this concept. So again, I reached out to full-time faculty and retirees at a public research university in the Midwest. And 43 study participants across 13 academic units participated in interviews with me. So let me give you a sense of the folks I spoke with. My sample is primarily comprised of females. There's a nice distribution across various age groups. You see race, you see academic field. I've tried to group academic units based on STEM, health, social sciences, and other fields to kind of see where they fall there. The majority of participants were tenure track. Around a third of the sample were non-tenure track faculty members. I only got one retired person to speak. And boy, were they really open and honest, because again, as they said, they can't fire me for sharing my perspective. And then in terms of the total years, they were a faculty member, not just at IUPUI, but in general, you kind of see where they fall. And then I was really excited about this here. About a quarter of my sample, they had current or prior administrative experience at or above the assistant or vice dean level. So whether they were assistant dean, associate dean, vice dean, or a dean, having folks who understood what it was like to be a faculty member and perhaps have experienced service shaming, but then, like Trevor, be charged with addressing these issues or any management issue within their academic unit. I mean, those are, that's quite a challenge. That's quite a task. And so I was really grateful to hear from folks who had their own problems and then who at some point were also responsible for solving the problem. Because when it comes to understanding how do we manage this issue, I thought those folks, administrators, were really well positioned to speak about this. So in terms of data collection, I conducted semi-structured open-ended interviews via Zoom. And I'll tell you what, as an aside, and I want to stay focused here. If the pandemic taught us anything, it's how to use Zoom. And in the past, I would confine interviews to telephone interviews, but to be able to see people's faces via Zoom, and they were all open to me recording them. This is really a helpful tool. So if you're doing interviews, I totally recommend Zoom. And I did these interviews from February to April, so just over the past couple of months. So just a lot of interviews, and they each last around 45 minutes. My protocol was pretty long. It had 16 questions, but I wanted to give you just a taste here of some sample questions. What are the types of things that I'm asking? So I asked, what discourages you from participating in faculty service? How do faculty members in your academic unit talk about and characterize service? Besides the time commitment, what's the greatest deterrent that you're experiencing? I shared my definition of service shaming, my working definition, and I asked them, based on this definition, have you experienced service shaming? It's not listed here, but I also asked, based on this definition, do you perceive that colleagues of yours have experienced service shaming? And from your vantage point, how did they cope with this? How do you perceive that it affected their performance? So I certainly asked them to discuss things from their perspective, but what they're seeing too in their environment also matters. Then I asked, how might we know service shaming? When do we see it? What might it look like in practice? What can universities do to eliminate service shaming? And then I think that last question is key. What can faculty members who have experienced service shaming do for themselves to navigate, cope with, and overcome the harms of service shaming? So again, these are just a sample. These are selected questions from my protocol, but I wanted to get a holistic perspective on service shaming. Now, I should say too, that I wanted to catch the flip side of the coin too. I wanted to know what motivated them to participate in service, for example. What institutions and norms gave rise to their desire to contribute to service, right? I just can't focus on what prevents you from wanting to participate in service and how you've experienced service shaming. To look at this concept holistically, I need to know what motivates people to engage in these concepts as well. So to look at the data, I have an amazing undergraduate research assistant who worked with me to kind of comb through the data to identify codes, to categorize them into themes, to help me see the larger picture of what I'm discussing. And she is fabulous, and she's not shy of telling me that I'm wrong, which is what we need when it comes to qualitative research. So in terms of the findings, let me give an overview first. Service shaming is widespread across demographic groups. So I really started this project assuming wrong. I was wrong, that mainly women and members of racial and ethnic minority groups were going to be the primary individuals experiencing service shaming. What really struck me in this study is that a supermajority, if you will, of those I interviewed, we're talking about 3/4+ of the sample have experienced service shaming at some level, whether it be to an extreme degree or just a little bit of it. It is less common in the health fields, mainly because health fields have a practice-oriented component where, at least based on those I interviewed, they said it was expected that they go beyond their research and teaching in order to impact the communities that they're serving. They still certainly experience service shaming, but I noticed that there was a distinction in terms of the level at which health-affiliated faculty experienced this. It was less intensive for non-tenure track faculty, which makes sense. At the university where I conducted my study, the expectations, right? The official percentage allocation of what faculty members were expected to do for non-tenure track faculty members, oftentimes there was a higher service expectation. But even then, think about this, even then, when the non-tenure track faculty members expected to do more service compared to their tenure track counterparts, they still experienced service shaming as well. And then it was less intensive for tenure track faculty. Among those who were on the tenure track, it was really assistant professors who were getting or experiencing rather service shaming at a very high level. Now, it did not completely disappear once they became, at least in this study, associate or full professors. But again, at the assistant level, it was quite high. And that's probably consistent with what you might expect, right? Get a new job as an assistant professor on the tenure track. You're at a research university. You are expected to focus on research because the reward structure and the incentive structure suggests that research needs to be your primary focus. So I can't say that the assistant professor component of service shaming was a surprise. So I wanted to come up with the typology to kind of organize the sources of service shaming. So I want to go back to the very beginning when I told you, I want to revisit the purpose of the study. So I said, I want to understand, I gave you the definition of service shaming. Then I wanted to know the sources of service shaming. I wanted to know the consequences of service shaming. Then I wanted to know the management. How can we go about managing and hopefully eradicating service shaming? So in terms of the sources, I think they can be captured based on this typology. They were either formal institutions, right? So think about anything that's written or official, such as that which is in a governing document, things of that nature. Official policies, faculty constitutions within an academic unit. There were informal institutions as well. So these are norms, so to speak. And then on this side, we have non-malicious intent. One thing about service shaming is that oftentimes that is not the intention. When someone is service shamed, oftentimes it would come from mentors and colleagues who cared deeply about a faculty member and wanted them to say earn tenure. And they know the expectations within the academy and specifically expectations within the field. And maybe they would say things to the effect of, oh, you need to focus on your research instead of service. Now, I certainly think that's shaming, but I do want to make clear that in large part, the service shaming isn't malicious, which is why it's kind of hard sometimes to capture service shaming, because it's not always intended to be a bad thing. But then there is service shaming that is quite malicious. So let's start under informal institutions with non-malicious intent. So this could be communication by leadership. This could be a dean, this could be an assistant dean, it could be an associate dean, saying something to the effect of, you know, service doesn't really matter in order for you to succeed here. Or service doesn't really count. That's not something that matters in order for you to be successful here. That sort of messaging that is informal, but is not intended to harm the faculty member. The same with colleagues. There were a lot of statements where those who participated in interviews would hear things told directly to them that, oh, well, that doesn't really count, right? You know, that, yeah, I'm glad you're doing it, but I'm not really glad you're doing it because you should be dedicating time to focusing on your research, right? Things of that nature. And then there are these subjective performance assessments. So for example, it could be that there was a formal expectation that faculty engage in service, but when it came to the evaluation of one's service, it was dismissed. Not because someone was trying to be mean to someone, but because there wasn't an informal infrastructure that was created to value service. So for example, multiple faculty members brought up that in committee meetings, such as annual review meetings, for example, that service was kind of routinely dismissed when there was an evaluation of other colleagues, right? So it's informal because, yeah, it's certainly specified in formal policy that service should matter, but informally, it never mattered. And as a result, when faculty members were evaluated, their service contributions weren't given much weight. Now, there's also informal institutions with malicious intent. And folks, this can be pretty wild stuff. I mean, it wasn't uncommon in this sample for this to occur. So it could be communications by leadership where they're removing you from a committee. And they're saying, we don't want you serving on that committee. We don't really like your perspectives. Get off of that committee. And really targeted at a faculty member, or a faculty member basically being told that assistant professors aren't welcome on that committee. Yeah, if you care about that, well, you need to get tenure first, and then we'll care about your perspectives. And I'm not talking about the promotion and tenure committee where you're expected to be tenured before you're on it, right? I'm talking about committees such as those that are committed to addressing DEI and things where we would hope that there would be there would be inclusion rather in terms of who would serve. Sometimes there were informal institutions of malicious intent based on communication by colleagues. And based on this study, based on what I'm hearing people, what I heard people say, man, some of their colleagues can be pretty harsh, right? I mean, basically saying that, that service that you did, it doesn't really matter. We don't really care what the P&T guidelines say. You need to focus on your research. And basically almost using the service shaming as a threat to say, if you're not doing research, then you're wasting your time. I want to focus now on the formal institutions. So I want to note that in terms of formal institutions with malicious intent, I didn't find anything there, right? This shouldn't surprise us because if an institution is going to be malicious in formal language, then you have a lawsuit on your hands, right? And so I would say before I get into this box here, the issue, or I would say the underlying force of service shaming is that it's so wrapped up into our culture, right? In ways that are not connected to formal manifestations of these beliefs. So I do want to make clear that it's really the informal features tied to service shaming that are primarily driving the show. And I think that's a problem because it's oftentimes hard to prove that informal activities are actually happening because it's easy to dismiss. So let me go to this box. I don't want to get too far off track. I'm getting overly excited, so let me stay disciplined. In terms of formal institutions with non-malicious intent, many faculty members spoke, I shouldn't say many, multiple faculty members spoke about the substandard criteria for service as a form of service shaming. In other words, there was an expectation that you engage in high quality research. And that was specified in certain documents, whether it be P&T documents or other documents. That there's a high standard for teaching and an expectation that you engage in that. And then when it came to service, it was like, serve on the committee, checkbox, right? It wasn't that straightforward per se, but it was clear that there was a distinction between how research and teaching were valued, and then service was basically just check the box. And many faculty felt that formal institutions within their academic units really were in alignment with this. And then the reward and incentive structures are oftentimes the lack thereof. So many faculty members commented that it was oftentimes clearly specified what one can gain from a reward-based perspective, from an incentive-based perspective when they engage in research and teaching. But that incentive structure through formal documentation wasn't really clear, or at least was not even discussed when it came to faculty service. So I have some excerpts for you, and here's what I want you to do just to yourself. So I didn't classify them when I'm presenting them to you based on where they fell in these boxes, but I think it's a helpful exercise just to think by yourself when I'm sharing these quotes. Are they informal, non-malicious, informal, malicious, or formal and non-malicious? Again, and some of these actually don't fit clearly into these categories actually, but just think to yourself. So one person stated, so there's the real criteria for P&T, and there's the written criteria for P&T. And I'm not so naive to think that those will always be the same, right? So when it came to service, there was almost this admission that, yeah, the P&T standards state that service actually matters and that we should engage in service. But I know deep down that my service is not going to be the primary basis for my evaluation. Here's another interesting one. And if I read these to you folks, I'm not trying to insult your intelligence. I just really enjoy reading out the experiences of folks who've made time to speak with me. Someone stated, a colleague, and this to me was not only shaming, it also had a degree of bullying involved to it, had actually been recruited to build and develop a program. When she came up for promotion tenure, they shifted the ground. Like it was valued and then suddenly it was devalued. And in the devaluing of that effort, suddenly her promotion was put in jeopardy And yet she had been getting every cue in the world that this service was exactly what they wanted. So the entire time, somebody is working. First, they're recruited to come to the university to engage in program building, an important type of service and leadership, and told the entire time, we value the work that you're doing. We care about it, keep doing it. And then when it's time to go up to P&T, should have been publishing more. That is service shaming, right? And I actually like what this person stated. It's bullying. It's a form of academic bullying. Next, we have these strategic plans and we have these values institutionally that I feel like my practices are aligning with. But I'm told, no, you're spending too much time with undergraduate students. And this was by somebody who was assigned as my faculty mentor in the department. So that's not super helpful. And I wasn't really sure how to respond to that given the different power differentials and dynamics. So it's pretty sad, actually. So you're looking at strategic plans. You're looking at documents and what the university is saying that it represents. And then you're being told, we actually don't believe in that. That is a form of service shaming. Someone stated, so when the service is invisible and you think it's great stuff, that leaves you feeling bad. Nobody said that it was bad stuff. It was just nothing to them. So this wasn't even communicated to this person, right? No one came and said that what they were doing was bad. But when they reflected on the formal institutions and the norms, they just kind of felt that the service that they were engaging in wasn't actually going to be valued. It wasn't even worth discussing or considering. So what are the consequences of service shaming, right? And these are things that I spoke with the respondents about as well. How does this affect you? How is this affecting your overall performance? And I'll try to be brief here because I do want to leave time for questions. It affects faculty morale. Faculty actually have left jobs because their service was not valued and they would go somewhere else. There's the prevention or erosion of networks, mentoring, and collaborators. When you engage in service to your institution, when you engage in service to the broader community, you build a network. You identify mentors. You identify potential collaborators. I mean, for those who've served, engaged in service, whether it be internal or external to the university, I imagine that you have met people who have helped you personally and professionally. And when you are service shamed, and if you kind of fall in alignment with that service shaming and you withdraw from service, then you're losing your network. You're losing mentors or potential mentors or collaborators. Next, faculty become independent contractors. If you aren't supposed to engage in service, you could just focus on your research. You don't have to be about the institution. You can sit in your office, you can focus on research. Now, the university is going to stay alive because of the work of everyone else, but never mind that. You can just go along and act as if your career is the only thing that matters and that you're the only person that matters. Faculty feel this way. A lot of them think, you know, if I can't engage in service, or if we're not going to create a culture where service is valued, then I might as well just sit in my office, right? It brings about that culture. Next, limited discussion or professional development around service. This one is actually pretty sad. Folks, because of service shaming, didn't even feel that they could talk with other people about whether or not certain service activities will benefit their career, because they were afraid they'll be told, just don't do it. And so professional development is limited because service apparently is so bad that people can't even talk about it. Limited investment in service by senior faculty members due to prior socialization. Folks, we can't expect folks to be leaders or faculty members to be leaders in their departments when it comes to service or leadership if they're told the entire time with their assistant professors that it doesn't matter. People just can't flip the switch like that. So if you're having a hard time as an administrator getting faculty members to engage in service, then you're part of the problem if you were service shaming to begin with. So I'll skip this for the sake of time. So what can universities do to eliminate service shaming? First, I think you need to acknowledge if you engage in this practice, right? So if you are an assistant dean or provost, anybody with a leadership position, if you feel to some extent or in some way that you have engaged in service shaming, or that your academic unit has engaged in service shaming under your leadership, admit it. Call attention to the concept. It's important to be inclusive in your messaging as well. As leaders, we need to not simply call attention to faculty who are engaging in research and teaching, but also show the value of service as well. Regardless of your primary focus, you should be valued in a university setting. And then it's important to create institutions that promote a service-empowered infrastructure. I think a really good example is institutionalizing administrative positions. So someone had mentioned to me, we have an associate dean for research, we have an associate dean for academic affairs, but we don't have an associate dean for service and community engagement, for example. And what sort of message does that send when we don't invest administratively in service? Someone else brought up that why don't we have sabbatical for service-oriented projects? We have sabbatical for research. What if you could transform an aspect of the community or feature within the university through your service and to be given time through a sabbatical to do that? Those sorts of institutions. In terms of coping mechanisms, for those who have experienced service shaming, recognize that you're not alone. Arm yourself with information to help you make your case. If you care deeply about service and it's a part of your story, look at the P&T documents, right? Look at documents that demonstrate that what you are doing is important. By arming yourself with that information, you're not simply learning about how your research or your service rather fits within the university's infrastructure, but you're teaching other people as well to value this. Demonstrate how your research is synergistic with your service is synergistic with your research and teaching. Find a community of like-minded scholars and connect the work that you are doing with national and international conferences, because there's a legitimacy if your service work is tied to associations that are scholarly in nature. So lastly, I would like to state that this is not about reducing the importance of or emphasis on research and teaching. Research matters. I'm an advocate for research. I'm an advocate for teaching. I simply think that service also matters. Folks, the legitimacy of higher education, I think, is at stake. The public thinks we're oftentimes that faculty members are a bunch of ivory tower academics who could care less about how the work that they are doing transmits to society writ large. Public opinion on universities is not high. If we don't get our act together, and I think acknowledging the value of service and institutionalizing mechanisms to uplift service can help the broader public. It's one variable that can help the broader public see the value of what we are doing. We also see a reduction in state appropriations that are going to institutions, public institutions of higher education. We need to do a better job of demonstrating to lawmakers that what we are doing has legitimacy. But we can't do that if we undermine one of our core responsibilities. Look at the elimination of tenure. I hope tenure exists everywhere. I really do. But it wouldn't surprise me that in 10, 20 years, if it doesn't exist, because a lot of folks thinking that they think we're resting on our laurels. So service must matter in order for us to be taken seriously by stakeholders. Next generation of scholars is very service-minded. Look at our students. They care about social justice, sustainability, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our best and brightest aren't going to want to be faculty members if we create a system that basically devalues service, the very thing that they care about. And so lastly, I'll say that this is an ongoing study. I need to do a lot of work to refine and enhance this work. so that it can be acceptable to peer review outlets and to gain acceptance from folks who can do something with this knowledge in order to bring about change. But I feel that I've reached a lot of saturation in speaking with folks. And a lot of the issues that I'm identifying, these aren't one-off cases. These are systemic issues that I'm seeing consistently throughout the data. But I know there's more work that needs to be done, and I know I need to be critiqued in order to enhance this product. So I welcome your question, and thank you all so much.
Open it up for questions.
Dr. Merritt, if you'd like to stop sharing, that way anyone on the Zoom could just raise their hand or indicate that they have a question as well.
Perfect. There's always more pressure navigating this in front of everybody than just doing it on my own screen. I forgot where the stop share was. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So you mentioned that in your sample you had these folks who were or had been in leadership positions. So I was just curious whether or how those folks voiced any opinions.
I actually think in terms of the sources of service shaming, that their opinions were pretty consistent with the rest of the sample, mainly because I think a lot of them were speaking from the perspective of their experiences as a faculty member. I believe that where I really saw the distinction is when they spoke about what we could introduce institutionally to bring about change. So they were really helpful there. Faculty offered very thoughtful management and institutional insights, but those administrative leaders, they have a lot of experience, and their primary duty, at least at this point in their career, was to come up with solutions to problems. And I would say the biggest distinction was in introducing those ways to address the problem.
Chris Ray up in the Zoom. You can I think you can just
click
it. I think you already answered this. Yeah.
All right, Chris.
Oh.
Hi, everybody. You can hear me in the room?
Yes.
So wonderful talk, really interesting. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I really enjoyed it. And I think it's very important. I have a question about sort of a broader question, perhaps. So the way that you're approaching the problem is to sort of say, we have these three categories of things: research, teaching, service. Service is systematically, institutionally disincentivized, and here are ways to solve that problem. I think that's a wonderful approach. A different way to think about the same problem is that those categories themselves are less mutually exclusive than they should be, and that service-oriented research and research-oriented service, for example, are things that are harder to disentangle, and that maybe those categories are problematic. So I'm just curious about how you would think about research that is service, or service that is research, in a way that sort of breaks apart the categories themselves.
Yeah, Chris, I think this is a really good question, because what I'm about to state comes from one of the individuals who participated in an interview. They think the categories are problematic: research, teaching, and service. This individual thinks that we need to identify the values that we care deeply about, whether it be social justice or social equity or sustainability from a departmental perspective, and to do whatever we can to uplift those values through research, teaching, and service. And so it's more about starting with the values as opposed to starting with the categorization. My second comment is what you have characterized, I think, is really reflective of a larger issue we have in academia, and that is we don't often encourage, or at least encourage enough in my view, for scholars to identify synergies across these three areas. We're so concerned oftentimes on these buckets that we overlook the fact that each of these areas reinforce and inform one another. So for example, if someone is engaging in community service, their research is actually made better if they're studying that topic because they've engaged with a broader community. So I'm not sure if I answered your question as much as I do think that we need to get away from stopping with the categorization, we need to identify intersections across research, teaching, and service, and we need to anchor what we do, not in the research, teaching, and service categories, but in the values and the broader objectives that we hope can be achieved by participating in those activities.
I have a question. So, I mean, one of the things I love about what you're doing is that you're talking not just about engaged service to communities that we do with our, and oftentimes it is like engaged research that we're doing, but it's also service here within the university. But I'm thinking those are two, like, I'm just trying in my mind, think about like, how did you hear from participants and how are you, it's harder for me to think about how my research engages with my university service than it is for how my research engages with my community service, if that makes sense. Like, I'm just trying to,
Yeah, I would say, and that's a great point, Stephanie. For the most part, I felt that research overlapped with one's service to the broader community.
right.
It didn't necessarily overlap with service to the university. However, I will say that one's experiences, even if they're not tied to their expertise, oftentimes could inform their service to the university. So for example, I'm not a scholar when it comes to pedagogy, but my experiences in the classroom could suit me well when it comes to serving on a teaching and learning committee. But when it comes to pushing scholars to think about identifying synergies, I think we need to push them to think about their research. How can you overlap your research and your service? But we also need to push them to think about where they have a genuine interest and commitment. And when we do that, then I think we're better positioning scholars to be of service to the university. Because if we take away service from the university, it all comes crashing down. We're not getting paid for the work we're doing. Students aren't coming. So I think there is an intersection. I just think it's different, right? Then I think there's an intersection that is between internal university service and what faculty care about versus external university service and what people are researching. However, that's where the strategic thinking comes in. We oftentimes don't push faculty to be intellectually curious and strategic about how they're engaging in the enterprise of service. And I think when we push ourselves to have that conversation, then there actually may be more overlap than we're willing to admit, even if it's not purely scholarly. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Lots of thoughts running through my mind, but I heard you say in the beginning that you kind of had an expectation going in that women and folks of color might be experiencing service shaping a little bit more, and that wasn't necessarily the case. But I know there's like an ongoing dialogue in like academic Twitter. You know, I've been talking about this during the pandemic, where expectations for service sometimes disproportionately fall on women, particularly women of color. And so I'm interested if you heard from your participants about different coping strategies and if there were gender dynamics to those coping strategies. If you have women faculty particularly that are expected to do all these service activities, but they're constantly being devalued.
I can't think of anything in particular that stands out. And I wonder if that's because it's viewing service in a different light, right? On one side, the point that you bring up, which is absolutely true, and it's a great point, there's a disproportionate amount of service that are placed on women and faculty of color. And as a result, oftentimes, those individuals are told to limit your levels of service so that you can be successful in your career, given the incentive structures within universities. This study is more focused on valuing service in the hope that, in part, that any disproportionate treatment when it comes to service expectations will become less of an issue, right? Because when you reward it, then when there is disparate treatment, then it has less of a negative effect. I will never endorse disproportionate treatment when it disadvantages certain people, right? But I think hopefully the hook with this study is that we can kind of reverse the narrative if we honor and reward and recognize the very thing that is overburdening a certain group of people. And so with regard to coping strategies, I did not hear of those with respect to disproportionate levels of service. They fell pretty much squarely on service shaming and how to deal with that. Yes, please, Fred.
So I'm a dean here in the institution. I'm the dean of the public affairs program and sporting towards community service. So I'm on your team. I'm here trying to cultivate service. And Stephanie suggested I'm happy to work for you someday.
I don't think you have to worry about that.
But the spirit of this being exploratory and helping you advance your scholarship, I'd be curious, the choice of the word shame has a very specific connotation. And in my mind, a very narrow connotation, yet you're using it in a very broad way to encompass lots of different kinds of behaviors, for example. So in your 2x2 table there, you have non-malicious intent. Shaming. In my mind, when I think of the definition of shaming, it is malicious in its intent, or if not malicious, it's intended to draw attention in a negative way to a particular, as opposed to, say, some of the examples of benign neglect, where it's, we didn't mean this in a bad way, but the person received it, they received the signal. So talk a little bit about your commitment to that term. And one suggestion as you're talking about it is sometimes it's more powerful to keep it more narrowly focused, because then you can call out the really egregious instances of bullying, et cetera, but still describe the broad phenomenon. So the spirit of there's more work to be done here. How committed are you to the broad use of shame for all of these different kinds of things?
I think you bring up a good point, Trevor. And one of my respondents actually brought this up as well. And their concern was it could be hard to bring people to the table to address the issue if it's viewed as solely negative when it's not always intended to be that way. I think that's a difficult question for a couple of reasons. Because the term service shaming attracts attention, right? And so I want people to pay attention to this concept. At the same time, I think we have to recognize that just because the intention behind something is not intended to be malicious, that the shaming occurs because of the harm that is experienced. So I think I could even view this in terms of kind of the isms that we talk about in society. Oftentimes, there isn't any intention for us to engage in certain behaviors, but I think the term gives power not to the individual who engaged in the act, but who experienced the act. And so even though service shaming, quite frankly, occurs when you have mentors who really care about you and they're not intending to do harm. So in that sense, it's like, man, service shaming, that's a bit of a stretch because it's never intended to be that way. But I continue to be reminded of the effects of even the most well-intended forms of service shaming. And it's really bad. It's changing career trajectories. It's forcing people to move to different institutions. It's making folks feel devalued. It's making folks feel that they don't have a place in the university. And so the shaming concept is more to honor the negative effects that it's causing on those who are receiving the shaming. But I think you raised a really good point. Maybe it's worth focusing service shaming on those malicious acts, whether those be formal or informal institutions, because maybe we can better come up with solutions for the problem if we're narrow in capturing what we're intending to capture.
Well, I think there's two ways, given what you said. I mean, I totally appreciate your response about the harm done to the recipient. There are likely degrees of harm. So it may be worth differentiating those degrees of harm and having terms that allow you to differentiate between the most harmful instances, i.e. denial of tenure, right? Like that is a clear, part of what we're concerned about is the progression of somebody through the institution. There's no question that not being able to continue with the institution is perhaps the most harmful, one of the most egregious instances. So I think you could think about it in that way, the differentiation, the experience of that being harm, as well as differentiating the intent. I think it's important to incorporate both. You know, in the criminal justice system, we distinguish between crimes and hate crimes, right? I mean, there's a clear, the intent is written into the law, and we add extra penalties when the intent is based on a discriminatory because of someone's race, their gender, etc. I think you could do a similar kind of thing here, and with more inquiry, you may find people describing it in different ways. The other thing you might do is, and you made reference to this in describing, you ask people about the things that led to them fostering that, cultivating that service. The questions you put up suggested a kind of prejudicial inquiry into, I'm trying to find service shame. I wonder, did you also ask, were there instances of service celebration, the reverse, like giving people the opportunity to describe how they felt, not only like, oh, here's a way I can participate, but this was in fact cultivated.
Yes, no, for sure. I think I just wanted to be dramatic during my presentation to make it seem like I'm a Law and Order episode or something. But no, I asked certainly the positive side, what motivated them to participate in service. You know, in what ways did administration, for example, encourage you to engage in service? Because you're right, we don't want to lead them down a certain direction when it may not be there. It kind of reminds me of student evaluation, right? If you ask someone, you know, where is the professor not doing well, they'll certainly find it. And so I think for this research to be balanced, I have to look at both sides of the coin, but it's also helpful to look at both sides of the coin because I actually think, and I know I pose a very doom and gloom picture here, but there are academic units at the place I interviewed faculty members. They're few and far between, but there are places where service is valued. And if we really highlight the faculty experiences in those environments, then we can come up with better solutions to addressing service shaming. We have to learn from folks who are doing it right. And I don't want to suggest in my presentation that service shaming, while it's widespread, it's not unanimous in its acceptance. There are places, academic units who are saying, we want service to be a part of our identity and we need to learn from them. So back to your original question, I do think the interview protocol gets at that. I just want it to be dramatic.
On that line, we are out of time, but folks are going to be able to meet with Dr. Cullen afterwards. So PhD students, please stick around to have coffee, and I think we're having, is it pastries? Pastries that Alan has arranged to have with PhD students. So please stick around for that and thank me, or join me in thanking. Great.